Persona saw a massive leap in popularity after the success of Persona 4, spawning anime and manga adaptations and even whole spin-off games, all laying the foundation for the franchise to truly take off, and that's exactly what happened, with Persona 5 becoming one of the most beloved games regardless of genre in the last decade. As well as the game's fantastic reputation, building up to release there was a lot of anticipation. Like I said, Persona 4 sowed the seeds, and because of that the hype train for 5 was longer and more intense. That meant more rumours and more expectations. One expectations a lot of fans were hopeful for was same-sex romance. You can see why after the theme was brought up with Kanji and was almost included with Yosuke. Some thought it was inevitable while others thought it was at least more likely, especially since queer rights had progressed significantly in both Japan and the West in the 7 years between the launch of 4 and 5. None of these rumours were quelled when series director for Persona 3, 4 and 5, Katsura Hashino, made the statement about 5 leading up to the game's launch during an interview.
There are a lot of people stuck between a rock and a hard place, emotionally speaking. On the one hand, they might not be keen on living by the same rules and values that defined previous generations, while still lacking the will to go out and actually break those barriers down themselves. That dark side of society is a central pillar to the game we want to make with Persona 5.
When people heard the game would follow characters who don't want to live by the previous generation's rules and feel emotionally repressed because of this, a lot of people assumed that queer characters, or at least one queer main character, would be a shoo-in. Well, spoiler alert, they were wrong. But just how wrong were they? Semi-controversially, Persona 5 didn't include gender options for our protagonist, so when discussing same-sex romance, people focus on the male options. While I'm sure there's a reality where any of the male social links could develop into a romance, the three most popular options tend to be three of the male party members: Ryuji, Yusuke, and spoilers, Akechi. Coming off the back of Persona 4 cutting Yosuke as a romance option, it's understandable why a lot of people might want his Persona 5 variant, Ryuji, to be romanceable. Shepard dives into his frustrating experience with Persona 5's romance options, using Ryuji as an example, the character who he would have chosen if given the choice, but that wasn't meant to be.
Joker's best friend Ryuji is undoubtedly the most adamant about prying into his love life. Within some of Persona 5's earliest conversations, the dopey delinquent asked my opinion on the women of the game, as well as tried to rope me into his schemes to pick up girls at various points, and every time he did, I could only choose to tell him I wasn't interested. This never led to Ryuji asking why I wasn't interested. He was just annoyed that I refused to go along with his locker room talk. The closest the developer got to allowing me to tell Ryuji that my version of Joker loved him was with the repeated implication that I wasn't interested in women. I felt I didn't fit into the narrative that Persona 5 spins. Ultimately, when Persona 5 reached Valentine's Day, when most players would see the culmination of whatever romantic relationship they pursued, I was, surprisingly enough, visited by Ryuji. As Ryuji lamented about his lack of a companion, all I was able to do was comfort him, joke around, and even ask him if visiting on Valentine's Day of all days was a confession. He promptly said no.
From a non-gay, non-sympathetic perspective, you might perceive Shepard's experience as whiny, but cutting through the top layer, you can find this is less about Ryuji being unavailable as a same-sex romance option, because from what you can see, that was clearly never in the cards. Instead, he's conveying frustration about his interactions with Ryuji when suggesting that his character might not be attracted to women were met with disdain and borderline disgust. Persona 5 cannot wrap its head around the fact that you wouldn't want to romance one of its lovely ladies, and when you're at the end of a playthrough single, where most gay players likely are, it'll proceed to kick you when you're down. So, not a great start for Persona 5 if you were looking to romance your best friend. But what about Yusuke? Not to rely on stereotypes too heavily, but Yusuke seems like a much more obvious choice, especially compared to Ryuji and his aforementioned locker room talk.
Yusuke is a more logical choice for a same-sex relationship, that is, if you're playing into the artsy stereotype. He's a young artist with a flair for fashion and philosophy. He even talks a bit slower than other characters to emphasise the ballad-like notes of his general conversation.
I also found a thread of players lamenting Yusuke not being a romance option.
It's like they created him to be the perfect gay boyfriend, cute dates and outings included, and then somehow forgot to include the direct romance option. I mean, for Christ's sake, he's even the character who gives you the most presents on outings. I always feel so good and uplifted when I hang out with Yusuke, and feel like I made him feel better too. Also, his goodbye quote about keeping my smile is so touching. Just let me date him, Atlas. Yusuke's the type of guy whose attraction transcends gender anyway. His social link is the thing that's closest to romance, in my opinion, in the entire game. He calls you his shining ray of hope and tells you to never lose your smile, which are the sweetest things I've heard in this whole game. I want to date Yusuke. I will fight for him. Not to mention he gives you the real Sayori to keep safe, which is the driving force of his motivation. He gives you one of the strongest pieces of himself. That can't be said for anyone else.
But in spite of all of this, Persona 5 does not permit a Yusuke romance. Even compared to Yosuke, whose social link was originally intended to end romantically, Yusuke's seems to surpass it in terms of underlying subtext. So what about Akechi then? From this point on, I'll be discussing some spoilers for the second half of both vanilla Persona 5 and the third semester of Persona 5 Royal. If you've completed Persona 5 or Royal and you can't wrap your head around where the popularity of pairing Joker, the protagonist, and Akechi comes from, then I can see where you're coming from. For most of Persona 5, Akechi is framed as a villain, and even when he teams up with the Phantom Thieves, it's usually because of a common interest, not because they're all suddenly buddy-buddy. Hell, even in the social link with Akechi, he will admit he hates Joker, so why is this pairing popular? Espiritu wrote an article walking through why she is so fond of the pairing.
Even from the beginning, Akechi's confidant is unique. When it begins, Joker comments, "It seems the detective Akechi is taking a liking to me." This is different from his reaction when beginning a confidant with other characters, where Joker will usually say something along the lines of, "I can sense a bond of trust coming from X," or "I've made a deal with X." From their initial interactions, Joker can already tell the way Akechi is treating him is special. While Joker spends the majority of his time with other confidants listening to their problems and helping them work through a major obstacle or internal struggle, Akechi and Joker spend their time together simply getting to know each other and exploring a variety of different locations together, from a cafe, a jazz club, an arcade, and even a bathhouse.
Their argument even acknowledges the infamous declaration of Akechi's hatred.
Yes, I hate you might sound like the exact opposite of a love confession, but let's look at the context here. Right after Akechi says this, he goes on to list a ton of qualities he finds attractive about Joker. Akechi is constantly telling Joker that he finds him interesting, remarkable, unique, and all other kinds of words that imply he thinks Joker is one of a kind. Akechi's "I hate you" refers to the fact that he's finally found someone who is different than anyone he's ever met, someone who challenges every belief he's ever had, someone who he wants to continue spending time with because of how it makes him feel, and someone who makes him want to keep improving himself for the better. As someone who grew up in extremely unjust circumstances with no real source of love from anyone, he doesn't know what it feels like to care about someone or have someone care about him. The reason Akechi hates Joker is because he doesn't know how to react to these new and unfamiliar feelings of love.
I appreciate a lot of the points Espiritu is making here, but it's easy to say that this is steeped in a lot of personal bias. Maybe Akechi and Joker's social link is structured differently because he's so important to the narrative. Maybe Akechi's awkwardness is just being misinterpreted as romance. Maybe Akechi meant what he says and genuinely hates Joker. But one point which I haven't mentioned yet is how Akechi is treated in the third semester. I've already given spoiler warning, but after flip-flopping allegiances a few times throughout 5, Akechi eventually dies near the end of the vanilla campaign, sacrificing himself to help save the Phantom Thieves. However, the twist of the Royal exclusive third semester is that Joker is forced into living in an ideal version of reality, tailored perfectly to everyone in it by the game's villain. In Joker's perfect reality, Akechi is still alive and on good terms with the Phantom Thieves, teaming up with them again for the final act of the game. Upon realizing that Akechi's existence and fresh start is contingent on the villain getting their way, we get a lot of melodrama all surrounding the deep and unique bond between the pair of rivals. Even after killing off Akechi in vanilla, Atlas couldn't help themselves in adding more fuel to the Shiwake fire for Royal. In spite of all of this, the subtext between Joker and Akechi is still highly debated.
Akechi tried to fucking shoot Joker. That's not love. That's just attempted murder. You're trying to apply logic to a clearly messed up person. What relationship? One tries to kill the other after saying he will never stop till he finally defeats you. One is a psychopath, the other wants to reform society.
This thread in particular gets very deep into bickering, but instead of focusing on Akechi and Joker's chemistry, it gets distracted by Akechi's morals and how Joker does quite easily overlook a lot of Akechi's villainy, which is worth pointing out as a narrative flaw of Royal, but it doesn't really answer the question at hand. One user who actually dislikes Akechi and the ship itself lays it out well from a neutral perspective.
It's pretty blatant. You really have to work hard to not see it. What I'm reading above is a lot of hair splitting over what constitutes a healthy relationship and why that disqualifies Akechi, but that's not the issue here. The topic isn't, is Akechi good for Joker? Discuss. It's, look, there's a lot of subtext, and I'm not sure why it's such a big deal for everyone. Obviously, you have people who will code their interactions differently, and since it's not canonically confirmed, we can't ever come to a definitive answer. But honestly, this kind of relationship isn't at all an uncommon trope in anime. Watch even a handful of the most popular anime from the past 20 years, and you'll quickly recognise a lot of the character beats in play here. It felt it was already pretty blatant in vanilla, but boy did they ramp it up in Royal, including that shoujo shot of the two of them smiling inches apart in a field of sparkling rainbow diamonds. I mean, come on. Come on.
Discussing Akechi is interesting because of his complicated character and what was changed with him between Vanilla and Royal. Seeing the popularity of the ship after Vanilla, did Atlas decide to intentionally bait it more in Royal, or did they simply think bringing back Akechi would be an interesting development to add stakes to the third act? I doubt we'll ever find out. Either way, in spite of all the extra attention given to the complicated and deep relationship between Joker and Akechi, nowhere in Vanilla or Royal does it get anywhere near official confirmation. But whenever people try and disprove this pairing, they always say Joker is straight, Joker is only into women, but never say it's about Akechi, so that's some food for thought. With all of this, you would think that Atlas had made a clear decision to not include homosexuality in any capacity in Persona 5, but as it turns out, that isn't the case.
What's even worse is the fact that there are two gay characters in the game. They're just the worst.
This scene is gross for obvious reasons. It reinforces negative stereotypes, Ryuji and Joker are both minors and these characters are adult men, and this same thing happens again later in the game as well. And the fact that these are the only gay characters we see in Persona 5 really just sucks. It harkens back to the style of dated humour used as Beautiful Lady on the Beach in Persona 3 and Yosuke's homophobia in 4, and shows that in spite of 5 aiming to represent those going against traditions of past generations, the game still feels content punching down. But notably, this scene is from the vanilla version of Persona 5. In Royal, the scene is changed considerably.
Speaking to IGN during a Persona 5 Royal preview event, Atlas Communications manager Ari Advincula explained that dialogue in certain scenes, specifically ones involving Ryuji and two effeminate male characters, would be changed so that those men were no longer shown in a negative light. We actually were able to go through some of the lines that players may not have received as well, look at that feedback and then update it for the current generation. Advincula also explained that their localization team has an internal content review team. She described it as very on the pulse about what's right and what to do. She explained Royal was a chance to make it right.
The scene was changed from the men coming onto Ryuji to instead wanting to put him in drag. So great, the offensive scene with little to no bearing on the narrative as a whole has been removed. Now everyone is happy. If you thought the backlash to Beautiful Lady on the Beach being changed in Persona 3 Reload was a lot, then this will likely be too much.
I extremely hate censorship, and don't trust those that sway away from their craft in the name of embracing shallow mediocrity like the rest of the corporate world. It sets a ridiculous and dangerous precedent that internet hate mobs could bully developers or localization teams into censorship. They don't even really like Persona 5 or JRPGs. They keep saying these games are too much anime garbage and how much better the games would be if they would take the Japanese out of them. I care about experiencing the game as original developers intended, not some sanitized version where everything offensive has been removed.
Of course there was backlash to this backlash, with people calling these claims of censorship ridiculous, partially because it's such a tiny excerpt from the game as a whole, and partially because it isn't even really censorship.
If you plan on boycotting this game out of principle because Atlas had the audacity to not want to offend another slice of their consumer base, that's your right. It's silly and you're missing out on a great game over a very small piece of it being changed.
Kane touches on it here, but looking at it from a more cynical but likely truer perspective, Atlas didn't make the change because they wanted to do the right thing, but because they wanted to sell more copies. And it worked. The movement to boycott Royal made little noise, and the game did incredibly well, now seen as a definitive way to enjoy Persona 5. However, the changes made aren't perfect by any means, as Dale points out.
The scene no longer revolves around the couple pressuring Ryuji into a sexual situation because they are attracted to him, but they do still pressure Ryuji into a situation he isn't comfortable with, rather than listening to his pleas to be left alone. The punchline is now, Isn't it funny that these gay men made a boy wear women's clothes, despite the fact that they were clearly making him uncomfortable?
So you can't have gay romance, but you can have gay characters that, despite everything, will not respect consent. Persona 5 is a massive game with a massive fan base, and I'm sure I've missed something. For example, Lala Escargot is a side character in a social link who is portrayed as ambiguously queer and is shown in a relatively positive light. Or I could talk about how Aunt's dynamic with Shiho is seen by some fans as potentially gay, or even the brief option in some demon negotiations where you can say that you like men. But from a broader lens, I think that's all I can say about Persona 5. I don't think people would be so frustrated about the lack of queer options if Hashino hadn't explicitly mentioned that he wanted to advocate for people who are oppressed in mainstream society.
As the game goes on, that outsider perspective becomes less of a core theme and increasingly becomes window dressing. While these characters may feel rejected, their outsider status doesn't always hold up under examination. The Phantom Thieves are framed as outcasts, but in an idealised way. They are marginalised in the way the kids in the Breakfast Club are marginalised. They may all be on their respective fringes, but they also all have places they belong. Queer youth are seldom as lucky as the Phantom Thieves. In many cases, they don't have safe spaces to return to at the end of the day, let alone unconditional love and acceptance.
Hashino's mission statement for Persona 5 ended up essentially being window dressing to give the game a bit more edge. The Phantom Thieves all face incredibly difficult circumstances, but societally speaking, none of them are oppressed because of their identity. And to be honest, there isn't really much wrong with this. Persona 5 is a beloved game that I still enjoy a lot, and I know a lot of queer Persona fans hold it in high regard as well, but I'm also hit by a pang of frustration every time I think about the game for too long. Persona 5 is at its best when it feels real. That's part of the reason why the Kamoshida arc at the beginning of the game is so well liked narratively. Kamoshida's exploitation feels grounded, and the fantastical way it's explored adds depth. Then the narrative starts to drift a little. I won't say it's bad, and it definitely still has its moments. But in a post-Kamoshida game, it's all of a sudden fine to date your teacher, but absolutely out of the question to suggest to your best friend that you might not be interested in women, and don't even think about wanting to romance a man. It creates a dissonance that makes Persona 5 occasionally off-putting for queer players.
Everyone in this game assumed I was straight, and those expectations infected conversations like a disease. I couldn't get rid of them no matter how many times I picked dialogue options that said I wasn't interested.
And like I said earlier, from a non-gay or non-sympathetic perspective, you likely don't care and don't see the issue. But for a game that aims to dismantle oppressive generational standards, it starts to feel like it's part of the problem it claims it's against. Before I continue going through the series entry by entry, I wanted to take a brief pause to talk about the entity that keeps on coming up when talking about every game no matter where the discussion goes. The fanbase. I'm no stranger to content that has a split fanbase. It's a strange phenomenon where people can be extremely passionate fans of the same thing, but end up butting heads because of drastically different opinions. Just like with JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the Persona series has this same issue. There are fans who are in favour of queer content in Persona and those who are against. That's why arguments over the Shinjuku gays changing in Persona 5 Royal get so heated, or the true meaning of Naoto's story in Persona 4, and even the addition of a pride pin in Persona 3 Reload. I think it all comes from a place of defensiveness, which from one angle I can understand. Like I've said, before Persona 5 blew up, the franchise was still relatively niche when considering the wider gaming sphere, so the communities that were fans of them, especially outside of Japan's, were just as niche. If you've put hours and hours into a game that you think is your thing, and then all of a sudden people start coming in after the series becomes mainstream and you have opposing opinions about it, of course you'll get defensive. And on the other hand, you have newer fans who feel just as entitled to their opinions since they've played the same game you have. Who cares if you played it before them? It doesn't help either that the issues brought up in Persona games, especially the ones related to queerness and gay culture, are already divisive in their own sense, and that's why these debates about certain Persona moments are so persistent. You might have already noticed that a common theme when discussing queerness in Persona is the series' Japanese origins. For Naoto, you would see people saying the true meaning of her story goes over people's heads if they don't have context about the Japanese police force. For the pride pin in Reload, people have claimed that in Japan, people don't know what the rainbow means and that it's just a rainbow. And even for the removal of the Shinjuku gays, you can see the same fans calling this insensitive Western localization teams not wanting to keep the game's true Japanese spirit. If you're a long-time Western fan of Japanese media, I can understand wanting the games to retain what makes them special, but at the same time it also feels infantilizing.
It's pretty disrespectful to Japanese LGBTQ people who exist, are politically engaged, and fighting every day for their rights just like us, to act like Japan is some alien faction beyond any reasoning, when the problem in question is this specific developer who hasn't caught up with the times the way many others in the industry, including Japan, have.
I'm not going to pretend that Japan is at the forefront of queer liberation, but to argue the opposite is just not true, and I think a lot of the more combative Persona fans will use the game's Japanese origins as an excuse to not want to see anything gay in Persona. I'm not exactly the only person who's picked up on this either.
I wanted to check the info about any possibility of same-sex romances being a thing in future games, and while I'm not going to lie, the amount of pushback and aggression I saw in various threads about same-sex romance options was really surprising. While not necessarily homophobic per se, the Persona community can get really combative and defensive when people take issue with a serious treatment of queerness. I posted something about the weird way Persona 4 treats LGBT issues, and I ended up deleting the thread because of how hostile people were. The Persona community is really homophobic. Not all of them, of course, but a big chunk, or at the very least, a big noisy part of it is.
The last point seems to capture it properly, that this is a loud minority. A very loud minority that seems to find every discussion about Persona online and tell you that you are playing the games wrong if you disagree with their interpretation, but a minority nonetheless. If I wanted to extend this particular discussion longer, I could bring up the exaggerated outrage around a black protagonist in the new Japanese Assassin's Creed game, or how Atlas using the word diversity when tweeting about their next game had people in the replies calling it propaganda and cancelling their pre-orders. But I'll put a lid on it because I want to keep this related to Persona. I still find it strange that there is a sect of Persona fans who believe that there is no chance that gay romance could be included in a Persona game. It would be easier to discuss if there was a precedent for how gay romance would be handled, but clearly that's just not going to happen.